In the name of God, te matua te tama te wairu tapu. Some words from Scripture. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness and patience. Bear with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And the peace of Christ will rule in your hearts, to which you are called. Lord our God, we thank you for this opportunity for service, and we pray that you'd give us the wisdom and the humility to seek the common good. Would you give us your grace, that we may know your light and your peace, as we listen, plan, work and talk towards the interests of all. We ask this through Jesus Christ, Lord.
Right, we'll move on to apologies, and I note that we have an apology from Councillor Staines for lateness, and you've just arrived, so that's great. Confirmation of the agenda. I'll move from the chair that Council confirms the agenda with the following alterations. In regard to Standing Order 2.1, Option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. Secondly, that item 20, the annual report to the Alcohol Regulatory and Licensing Authority, be withdrawn from the agenda. And that item 30, Project China, activity highlights November 2018 to 2019, be taken before item 28, the annual reports for Dunedin City Holdings. Seconded, Councillor Vandervist, you.
Yes, I'm unhappy with the inclusion of item C6, notice of motion by a council member, in the confidential and non-public agenda. I don't believe it's appropriate that it be in the non-public agenda, and I don't believe that we've been given information sufficient.
Well, what do you want to do?
I want to move that it be moved into the public part of the agenda and be taken out of the confidential non-public.
Is there a seconder? It lapses for want of a seconder. Are the motions on the table as it stands? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against?
No, recorded, please.
Thank you. Carried. Item 5, declarations of interest. I'll move that the council notes. Are there any changes before I note or amend to the declarations of interest? So that council notes the elected members' interest register attached as attachment A, confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interests, and notes the executive leadership team members' interest register attached as attachment B. Seconded, Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. On to item 6, confirmation of minutes. I'll move that the council confirms the public part of the minutes of the ordinary council meeting held on the 27th of August 2019 is a correct record. Seconded, Councillor Staines. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Minutes of committees. Economic Development Committee. Councillor Staines.
Thank you, Worship. I move that the Council notes the minutes of the Economic Development Committee held on the 3rd of September 2019.
Second, Councillor Wiley. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Finance and Council Controlled Organisations Committee. Councillor Lord.
I'd just like to move that the Council notes part items 1 to 7 in the public forum of the minutes of the Finance and Council Controlled Organisations Committee held on the 3rd of September, approves the following Part B item of the minutes of the Finance Council Controlled Organisations meeting on the 3rd of September, item 8, and takes the Part C items of the meeting in non-public.
No. Secondly, Councillor Newell. Any discussion? Put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Toy to Targa Settlers Museum Board. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'll move that Council note the minutes of the Toitu Otago Settlers Museum Board meeting held 21 August 2019.
Second, Councillor Elder. Any discussion? Put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right, minutes of community boards. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I move that we move the minutes of the community boards items 10 through to 18.
Second, Councillor O'Malley. Thank you. Any discussion on any of those? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right, we're moved on now to the reports. Item 19, application to extend, you're standing back, Councillor Gary's sitting back from this. Application to extend the urban water supply area boundary. Simon, Tom, welcome. Now, before we go to questions, do you wish to introduce this at all, or?
No, thank you. Straight to questions.
Okay. So we'll go straight to questions. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. In the report, there's a suggestion that it would cost several $100,000 to do the linkage, and I presume that's because, and I just want confirmation of, that you wouldn't accept a connection into a distribution line, and therefore the pipe is significantly longer than has been suggested otherwise.
Yes, thanks. That is correct. So connections to distribution mains within our network, they add a risk to what are strategic assets. So those assets perform a function for many customers. So in this case, that pipeline services all of the peninsula, and should it break for an extended period of time, could potentially mean roughly 10,000 people out of water. So to minimise that risk, we try and ensure that there are no connections to that pipe, and direct them to what we call a reticulation network, which is there for that very purpose. Much easier to isolate, much easier to, if we do have an issue or a problem, much easier to isolate the extent of that. Yes, so that's the reasoning.
Subsequent question. So the alternative arrangements that many people outside of the water reticulation area would have would be tanks and to fill those. Have you any idea about those costs?
Yes, so filling tanks is a reasonably common practice for the rural community. It costs in the order of between $200 and $300 to have a tanker come to your house and deliver water, and that depending on your water usage, can happen really regularly or not. But that is an option for users of tanks. Obviously, access permitting and all of that sort of thing.
Councillor Lord.
I have sympathy for these people and I understand their situation, but also have come to understand the cost to council if we do it properly, and we don't want to do improper work. But have we ever thought about, or is it possible when there's a number of houses that are quite close that have got perhaps what we call informal connections or whatever, is it possible to help facilitate working within what's already there, a much cheaper option than joining into the distribution line? Is it possible to just facilitate between neighbours some sort of a system that could work? Is that something you would consider at all, or?
It's a good question. So typically we get the best outcomes where that facilitation is coordinated through council. So facilitation through neighbours can be, the focus can be on the neighbours that are interested versus the neighbours that are not interested, and sometimes you get smatterings of people that are keen, and then a number of houses that are not, and then a number of houses that are. So it can be quite difficult to coordinate for members of the public, and you typically don't get the best infrastructure efficiency outcome. If we were looking at servicing a broad area, that would best be coordinated through council, but it would be an expensive exercise and one that would need to be, in my view, considered over time, probably with another set of options delivered to council.
What I wasn't so much meaning. Yes, I appreciate your answer, but it wasn't quite what I was meaning. What I was meaning is, so he's got neighbours around him that have already got connections. Is it a possibility that we could facilitate talking to a neighbour and saying, well, look, do you mind if we, you know, is there any way that we could just do something like a much cheaper fix, like just facilitate a T intersection into someone's 20mm hose or 15mm hose? Is that possible?
That solution would be outside of the provisions of our current bylaw. So transmitting water from one property to another through an existing connection it sits outside of the provisions of the bylaw, and also relies on the goodwill of those neighbours in perpetuity. And we've seen examples in more recent time where that goodwill has not lasted.
Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Tom. Just on that, I do have sympathy for these guys as well. And as I'm sure we all do around the table, but it seems to me that these guys are going through the proper process and following, you know, the law, as it were. But if this is turned down here, surely we're just recommending that they do that. Run a hose from a T section.
So yeah, just to be clear, we're not. So certainly as staff, we would not be keen on seeing that, and we would be put in a position where we would have to enact the bylaw. So that would not be a good outcome.
Do we know how many sort of connections like that there are on the peninsula at the moment?
We know what we know, and what we know is that there are many. But the many that we're aware of don't necessarily or have been formalised in some way, or there's been a paper to council to deal with them. That doesn't mean that the practice is good, and there is, in time, I think there probably is a case for looking at putting more robust infrastructure in place, but it's something that would come at a cost and would need to be carefully thought through.
Councillor Wilson.
Just understanding, should that suggestion happen, the liability for the council then is once we know, well, the question is, if someone went and did a connection with a hose and we knew about it and let it happen, are we then required to continue to allow that to happen? And that I understood that a city council that supplies a house knowingly will be is under duty to always supply, and that in itself has some issues?
I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question, so it's a tricky one. I would counsel that that council does not resolve to enable an informal connection, as it would be contradictory to the bylaw. However, if council did resolve that, then I think you're correct in that the connection would be there and we wouldn't take any course of action. But as I suggested before, I'd counsel that that was not the way we went.
Councillor Staines.
Looking on the map, and it appears that there is a disused water main that runs along those property frontages. Am I reading that right? The black pipeline?
No, that's the boundary line of the...
So I'm reading it wrongly on the...
So that black line denotes the boundary between a road and property.
Okay.
Councillor O'Malley.
Just touching on point 23, which is cumulative impact. Is this the tension that we often face on a boundary line where we're talking that this is the edge of the zone in which we're providing service, and then if we extend service beyond that line, then we obviously have set a precedence of extended service beyond the line, then there'd be expectations across the city at all boundary lines for that to occur? think I know the answer to that question. But.
Yes.
So then comes my next question, which is also noted in your report, that if you get multiple requests on a boundary line, is that what would then start to initiate the city looking at where it's setting that line and whether or not there's actually demand in that area, and then we would then question whether we would not provide services?
Yeah, look, if a number of property owners came to council seeking as a group to establish a supply, then that would be a far easier conversation to have in terms of extending the network, because you are genuinely extending a network rather than just one pipe for one property.
And then sort of along that same point, do we do reviews of demand internally?
Yeah, so there's a number of processes for that, the most significant of which is the Sanitary and Services Survey, which looks at all of the infrastructure provision for both drainage and water supply across the city. Our next one is due in about 18 months, 2 years.
And how do general ratepayers do they have any ability to influence that or input into it?
I am not certain. Scott, do you know the answer to that question?
There should be a public consultation process that goes part of that. Yep. Okay, so there will be, presumably, and then people who are on the boundary lines will be able to contribute at that point. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson, did you have another question?
Just happy to move the option 1 when you're ready, Your Worship.
Okay, are there any further questions? So just let me go to that. So you've moved option 1. Is there a seconder, please? Councillor Elder. Would you wish to speak to it, Councillor Wilson?
I share, as I do, as many people have noted, the sympathy for these people in their position. It's hard, but that's the nature of rural and rural residential living. And I have also spent a large time listening to campaigners during this elections talking about infrastructure. And while it's easy to look at one case on case, if we do this ad hoc, it's really hard to plan a city well and efficiently and effectively. And so I think this is a situation where we have to stand back from the personal, and it's hard, and there are other options out there which seem hard at the time, like tanks and water tankers, that many people already use every year. And we have to look at the policy and stick to it. And so I'll encourage you to look at the best outcome for the city, and that, I think, is declining this application.
For the speakers. Councillor O'Malley.
Just to basically, as a follow-up from my own questions, this is the issue really of whether you sit on the boundary line and the example of precedence. And I think that, unfortunately, this is what always happens when you're next to a boundary line of services, that you can see it just in the distance and you say, why not to me? But unfortunately, if we continue along that line, then obviously you become the boundary line and then the next person along asks. So we are at that sad point, and it is hard to say back to somebody that this is where the line sits right now. And I guess the feedback is that if you want that line moved, then the process is through the proper planning processes that we go into, and we'll be going to one in the future soon. Thank you.
Further speakers? No further speakers? Councillor Wilson, right of reply. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Tom. On to item 21. State Highway 88 Port Chalmers speed limit. Oh, you're staying for that, Simon? Just shifting chairs. Welcome, Nick. Do you wish to introduce this at all, or just go straight to questions?
Straight to questions.
Straight to questions. Questions, Councillor. Councillor Hawkins.
Happy to move.
Right, okay.
Second.
Right, so we've got a mover and a seconder. All we need is questions. Questions, Councillor Wilson.
The one thing that isn't in the submission, and I'm sorry, I've checked and I know somewhere I've read it, that Port Otago actually requires trucks going to it to be at 30 k's, and it seems an anomaly that if you've got, I think, the major transport company requiring 30 k's or trucks to be at 30 k's, then to provide cars to go 40 is an accident waiting to happen in itself. And I just thought that I think that's been a rule in place for some time, that it would be useful to add that into the submission if possible.
Further questions? Right. Did you get an answer?
Yes, we can add that in.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, it's been moved and seconded. Councillor Hawkins, you wish to speak to this?
I would do. Thank you, Your Worship. And it's great to be able to formally submit on behalf of the Council in support of this Council's position, which is to support the desire of the West Harbour community to reduce the speed limit in George Street, brackets Port Chalmers, as it's commonly known, not here in Dunedin, to 30 kilometres an hour. It's fitting that we're considering this today of all days, this being the first day of this summer's cruise ship season. Because there are two vulnerable pedestrian groups in the West Harbour region. Our increasing number of cruise ship visitors, many of them unfamiliar with our road layout, and many of them older visitors, and at the other end of the demographic spectrum between Albertson Ave and the Port Chalmers Library, there's one primary school and one kindergarten and one early childhood facility, and there's a very busy pedestrian route to and from those two facilities. At the same time, we're seeing an increasing amount of heavy freight moved by road, and that's a dangerous combination. We know that slower speeds make for safer streets, and I applaud the direction that the Transport Agency is heading in more generally in acknowledging that, rather than the old mode, which is wait for someone to die or get seriously injured and then panic and do something about it, taking a more proactive approach, particularly in suburban centres, and we've seen the pushback there in larger cities further north when it suggested that people might drive around slightly slower. There are obviously, from an engineering point of view, alternatives to the posted speed limit that make something a safer road environment through urban design, curb protrusions and the like. But as we all know around this table, there's not a lot of money in the budget for our suburban centres to do this work anytime soon. So this is a helpful interim measure, I think, until we get to have that conversation around how we treat our suburban centres. Councillor Wilson picked up on it. I'd like to thank Kevin Winters and Port Otago for how responsive they have been to the community's desire for slower speeds in this area. There have been, some of you may not remember, there were 2 summer trials that were organised. The desire of the community was for it to be slower in the interim. A voluntary code of practice has been brought about by Port Otago for heavy freight movements to go at 30 kilometres an hour, and that's largely been adhered to, and the port's business hasn't ground to a halt as a result of people going slightly slower for that short stretch. And I'd also like to thank, because I don't know if we'll get another opportunity to do this, Steve Walker, who's the outgoing chair of the West Harbour Community Board. There have been 2 significant projects for that community that have involved what is now the Transport Agency, the artist formerly known as NZTA. One is the completion of the shared path project to Port Chalmers, and one is the desire for slower speeds on the Maid Street. Both of those projects have required a great deal of patience on behalf of the community, and a lot of his job has been dealing with the frustration of the community in so far as it has dragged on and on. It's heartening to see light at the end of this particular tunnel with the speed limit issue. My understanding is that the tender process, or the tenders, are back for the completion of the shared path, and we should know sometime soon what kind of a time frame that's on. But I think it's a testament to the local community board and its leadership for its ongoing advocacy and soothing of local nerves around this. So thank you for bringing this to the table, and it's a pleasure to be able to formally submit as part of this process. Thanks.
Councillor O'Malley.
It's very good to see this going to this point. I just want to feedback to NZTA in general when it comes to communities and state highways passing through them, that I'm hoping we're moving towards a place where the authority can be more responsive to community requests and community needs. And I know that certainly, like in this case, originally one of the hold-ups was an attempt to actually analyse the whole of State Highway 88, just for the small section of it. And I think this is an issue of how the NZTA deals with communities and state highways. I think that we need to move to greater empowerment of communities when a state highway runs through the centre of it, and make sure that they have a greater authority and greater ability to influence outcomes. I'm glad to see that this letter is going in to support this change. Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I'm sorry to have missed question time. I was waiting for someone to come and collect me, so I don't know what's been asked, but what I would say is that from my understanding of safer journeys and the philosophy that if you make a mistake on the road, it should not cost you your life or anyone's life or serious injury. And from my experience of dealing with speed limit changes, the change in approach from small areas to whole of area, and in particular on the peninsula, the world does not end when the speed limit reduces, and in fact in this particular case it will save lives. The trials showed that it is possible, and I note that the speed, I don't know what it's called, but the thing that alerts you to your speed at the start of Port Chalmers is extremely helpful to educate all of us around our speeds and how we're approaching. I take to the point that when we have international visitors, often we have a saying in our household, you leave your brain home in a pickle jar. In other words, when you're on holiday, you're in that holiday mode, and particularly if you come from a country where the traffic is on the other side of the road, you often are not looking in the right direction. With so many children, international visitors, and most particularly, let's not forget the residents, because that's the key to it. This is a very good move. It has taken too long, and I agree with my colleagues that NZTA does need to be more responsive in a timely manner in future. I too want to acknowledge the input of the community board. This is what community boards are really good at. This is what they do. Advocating for their community with a clear and loud voice, and I acknowledge the work of my colleague Steve Walker in this regard over a very long period of time. Thank you.
Further speakers? Right, you write a reply? No, you don't want it. So I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay. On to proposed parking changes. Item 22. Do you wish to introduce this? You do, right. Far away.
Yep, a few preliminary comments. These are changes of a minor nature. One question that the subcommittee asked me at the meeting was how many parking spaces are gained or lost as a result of these changes. In relation to TPC 14, there's a net gain of 3 spaces, and in relation to TPC 15, there's neither a gain nor a loss. It comes out at about the same. So very minor changes in the scheme of things across the city.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Gary.
A question, I was curious about the wording. I'm looking at particularly page 67. The wording, ORC engaging with affected parties to notify change. I thought that was an odd, I just wanted to know why it was worded that way. I would have said that was telling people what's going to happen. Engagement to me means back and forward. Could you just explain that a little bit more clearly?
Yes, the process is that when properties near bus stops are affected, ORC notify the affected parties and then seek their feedback. So that is basically why it's worded that way, because we ourselves don't do that consultation. We do it in a joint.
Any further questions? Right, it's been moved. Councillor Wiley, do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Lord. Councillor Wiley, do you wish to speak to this?
Thank you, Worship. I'd say that Mr Sargent has summed it up pretty well. It was interesting as we went through that they were all minor changes, and the one that really surprised me was the one in example parking in front of Frozen Direct in Copelands. All along that street we have a lot of P60s and other signage, but yet in that 3-car space you could have parked there all day. And that was a request of the businesses in that area that we reacted to. So I'm more than happy to move that option 1.
Further speakers? There are none. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right, on to item 23, DCC submission on the green paper Vision for Hydra in New Zealand. Ms Graham and Mr Jacobs. Welcome, team. Right. Do you wish to introduce this or go straight to questions?
Happy to go straight to questions.
Straight to questions. So questions, councillors, on this submission. Well, if there are no questions, would someone like to move it, please? Moved Councillor Wilson, second Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Wilson, do you wish to speak to it? You don't? Are there any other speakers? That being the case, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay. Well, thank you, Sean, for your short stay. On to item 24, DCC submission on the proposed national policy statement for highly productive land. Can I invite Ms Johnson to join Sandy? Yes. Now, do you wish to introduce this one at all? No. No. Questions, councillors, please, on item 24. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. For sake of clarity, how much of the Tyree land would you classify as highly productive land?
Well, there are some figures provided in the submission on total areas, but I couldn't answer that because I'm not quite sure what you mean by the Tyree land, where the boundaries are. We can generate that information, I just don't have it to hand.
So, for example, looking at the 2GP map is what I am going by. If I'm looking from Gordon Road and heading back towards, say, to Invermay, there just seem to be a couple pockets of highly productive soils in that area. Is that what, am I right in assuming that?
Well, there's in the maps, there's two things. There's a layer in the 2GP itself, which is high-class soils, which you can look at. The highly productive land definition that's used in the policy framework was amended through the hearings process as a result of submissions from Horticulture New Zealand, who asked that wider consideration be given to things other than the land care layer of high-class soils. And so there is in the data maps that are also available on the 2GP website, the land use classification 1 to 3, but you have to go into the data maps to look at those because there's no specific rules that are attached to those. Rather, the policy framework that guides the application of zoning relies on a definition of highly productive land that says those land uses may be considered highly productive land, but also allows for some other factors to be considered, including how the land's currently being used. So there is more than what you see in terms of the high-class soils layer, in terms of what might meet the definition of highly productive land.
Okay, so then I have I know this is a consultation document, and we're submitting to the government on this. I'm getting what I'm trying to get in my mind is that the fact of what's going through 2GP in the review stage, and also where we're at with development, and trying to get in my mind balancing the two out. And this is what part of the document is all about. Totally agree with that. The other part is this sort of indicating that the DCC in this letter to government is fully supportive of protecting high-class soils versus development in some places?
Well, we are supportive, what the submission suggests is that the DCC should be supportive of balancing the two NPSs, so the NPS on highly productive land and the NPS on urban development. So the NPS on urban development essentially says that you can still identify future growth areas on highly productive land, but that only those that are identified for future growth shouldn't be subject to the NPS for highly productive land. So the two next to each other ask you to balance those considerations through your policy framework. They don't preclude urban growth occurring on highly productive land. They just ask that councils give due consideration to the importance of highly productive land.
Perfect, thank you for that clarification.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. The three guarantees in life are death, taxes and RMA reform. So I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where something like this isn't happening. But it's a timing question, really, and I didn't know whether to ask it for this paper or the next one because they're obviously related. So my questions are, do you have confidence that in making decisions around what these two national policy statements might look like, that they are being considered by MFE holistically, because there's obviously a natural tension between the preservation of productive land and urban development capacity?
I believe they are well aware of the tension, and that was expressed in the sessions that they hosted. So they hosted 1 2-day session in Wellington for all the planning managers across the country, and they came to Dunedin and did a session with us and for the public. I do believe they are well aware of the tension. I do believe that the teams that would be working on each of these documents are talking to each other, but how they reconcile that, or how it ends up after they consider submissions against both, would be very difficult to predict.
And a similar question, having been through the 2GP process where we had a new NPS to consider, quite advanced in that process for the NPS for urban development capacity, what is the merit in us continuing along with variation 2 on the 2GP in advance of these issues being resolved? Because then you risk having the same problem where you have to give effect to a national policy statement that has been given after submissions have closed on what your variation is, and it makes it difficult from a planning point of view to meet community expectations and your legal obligations under the planning framework.
I think that's a good question. I think as far as the NPS for highly productive land goes, I think the 2GP reflects it really well. I think there are a few things to iron out. In terms of the NPS for urban development, the key change really is that they've removed the special provisions for medium growth cities. So we've have less policies that are mandatory in terms of Dunedin. So I think in that context, I think the risk of proceeding with variation 2 is relatively low. I mean, there's always still some residual risk that there's something in there, but because it's familiar, it's similar enough to the current NPS UDC, and most of the changes are removing mandatory provisions, I think the risk is quite low.
Councillor Wilson.
I'm not quite sure if this is really a question for you, Anna, or not, but Dr. Johnson. One of the interesting things is we have a substantial amount of land, and through the 2GP we were advised that Otago has a substantial amount of high-class soils or highly productive land, and most of it's in Dunedin City. What you don't see is it being well used into highly productive product other than mainly pastorally. And I'm just wondering, the submission doesn't deal with that issue, and therefore a lot of people look around them and think this land's really ideal for development. So you've got this tension where you're protecting a land, but it's not necessarily being seen as being used. Do we have an understanding of why that isn't happening, and are there steps afoot from your sessions that you had in Wellington to understand if anything else is going to happen to encourage more highly productive use of land, and equally, is the city looking at doing anything to drive better use of that highly productive land?
Gosh, there's a lot of questions in there. I don't know the answer to the question of whether Wellington's going to do anything to look at it. I do note that the submission raises the issue of needing to take a precautionary approach and to realize that the economic situation may change in the future. So I guess the submission tries to address the issue in that the agricultural sector changes all the time. You know, trees, forestry prices go up and down, and we know that it's a very dynamic system, and so it's difficult to predict where it may head. So I guess that's all we can do in terms of the submission, is raise that it shouldn't be about what's productive at this point in time, but to consider how that may change over time. And I note that the NPS also raises the issue of encouraging farm amalgamation, and that I think is possibly the one thing that's in there that is maybe getting to that issue of why land may not be as productive as it could be, in that you need increasing sizes of land to be economic, but that it's really a hint possibly of that issue that you raise.
Councillor O'Malley.
Don't know what that is. Oh, there's two buttons. You've answered it, I think, but I just want to clarify. So what we're really saying here is that we protect this land because once it's lost to other development, it can never be used again for productive use, and therefore, even though currently the current model may say it has less economic value than, say, turning it into housing, when we change our attitude towards importing of food and other such things, the model may change again, and if we haven't protected it now, it won't be able to be used again in the future, such as Pukekohe is losing all of its fields like now. Thanks. Is that correct?
You win the John Bizet Prize. Right, any further questions? Oh, Councillor Wilson.
Well, I think that raises, and I don't know if it's something to be dealt with here, but if economic development are doing anything along that line, because it seems to be the one area that we could be growing the economy potentially better at in Dunedin City, and I don't know if that's a question that should lay on the table for some other day or as part of today's debate.
Not sure we can lay questions on the table constitutionally. Right, if there's no further questions, it's been moved. Councillor Benson-Pope, do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Newell. Councillor Benson-Pope, do you wish to speak to it? Don't. Any further speakers? Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Worship. Yes, just picking up on Councillor Wilson's point, at the moment it may not be economically viable to use that land, but I think as we go forward with carbon miles and emissions and protect yourself with a bit of food resilience, I think it's going to be crucial. And as Councillor O'Malley mentioned as well, once it's gone with houses on it, we're never going to get back to put cabbages on it. So I'm happy to support this.
Further speakers? There are none. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. On to the submission on the proposed National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which has already been referenced. Do you wish to introduce this? No? Just questions, councillors? Councillor Vandevers.
Check. Under discussion on page 97, it says, amongst other things, that the NPSUD seeks to remove unnecessary restrictions on development. And that sentiment I approve of. However, under the second generation plan, we have, far from removing unnecessary restrictions, we've created some, including, for instance, that South Dunedin house builds have to be relocatable if they're in low-lying areas anywhere, not just South Dunedin. And also the bizarre requirement that any granny flats must have a family member. Surely our own second generation plan flies in the face of removing unnecessary restrictions on development. Would you like to comment?
I think the 2GP overall creates a lot more development capacity than is available under the operative plan. For example, the operative plan doesn't enable family flats at all. So those being provided for is a new enabling provision that wasn't available before. Those would have been non-complying. The relocatable buildings is something that has come through the natural hazards provisions that were added to the plan, which was a joint project between ourselves and the Regional Council. So I think that's part of a package of response to natural hazards issues.
You've said just now that the second generation plan creates more opportunities overall, and yet in the second generation plan, the previous 15 hectare requirement for rural development has been massively boosted to 40 hectares, doing quite the opposite of creating more opportunity overall in rural areas. Given that the second generation plan in both rural and urban areas has, in the case of zoning 15 to 40 hectares and in requiring the relocatable, how can you justify saying that it actually removes unnecessary restrictions when these are massive restrictions in both rural and urban areas?
Well, I think the rural provisions are a different matter because rural provisions don't provide for urban development capacity. They are there to support rural activity and are set based on the goals for that zone. So I struggle to see the relevance of that. I think that, again, the relocatable provisions is a performance standard. It doesn't prevent residential housing. If one needs a consent, it's a restricted discretionary consent and matters can be considered. So if it's unreasonable in a particular case, it's not a particularly onerous consent to receive if it doesn't work in a particular context. So overall, I don't think either of those things would have done any harm to the urban development capacity provided in the plan.
Councillor O'Malley.
I just want to clarify a perception around the provision of allowing accommodation for relatives on your property. Is that a permissive activity that allows basically families who want to look after maybe an older relative on their property and therefore we're now allowing them to do so, as opposed to a restrictive activity which says that you can't put anything on the back of your property unless you have a relative in it, as it's somewhat being interpreted these days?
Being guided that we're getting slightly off topic, but no, it is clearly a provision to enable something that the community said they wanted to be able to do. Like I said, under the operative plan, that would have been non-complying, and the community told us they would like opportunities to house family members on site in a semi-independent state, so we provided that opportunity through the plan.
Further questions? Councillor Benson-Pope is moving. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Benson-Pope, do you wish to speak to it? Further speakers? There are none. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Item 26. Submission on Ministry for the Environment proposed priority product and priority product stewardship scheme guidelines. I think we've got Mr. Drew, Mr. Henderson and Ms. Irvine. Just a bit of congestion on the overbridge.
What are we doing?
Aren't we doing 27?
I thought we were doing 20.
26.
Guided by you, Your Worship.
Our number is...
That's the next one on my list.
Yeah, environment. Oh, okay, fine.
Yep. Priority products. Welcome. You'll be allowed back, Sandy, don't worry. Welcome, team. Now, do you wish to introduce this or just go straight to questions?
I'm happy to go straight to questions.
Right. So we'll go straight to questions, folks. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Worship. I haven't managed to find the exact paper in the confusion, but there's commentary in the submission around single-use plastics and the suggestion is made in the submission that single-use plastics that can't be recoverable should be banned. And I'm just wondering about those comments in the context of medical supplies, packaging, or otherwise, whether the intention is for those to be included, which is quite something from shopping bags and drink bottles and the like, which are referred to, or which we're being specifically asked for feedback on.
Yep. So the product stewardship around container deposit for plastics in particular, and in the single use even, is looking at bottles. So it wouldn't be looking at medical waste plastics.
But you can see where the confusion comes if our comment is all other single-use plastics that can't be recoverable should be banned. It could be interpreted to include syringes or otherwise, which I assume can't be recoverable in any sanitary way.
Yes, I agree. I can make an amendment to that. And yeah.
Can I just clarify for those of us who are a little confused that this submission is not in our agenda papers, it's in the supplementary agenda. It's item 26 if you're looking for it. Okay, further questions? Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a question about your reticence in making any comment about methyl bromide. I mean, I want to come back to that later and by way of an amendment, but there's no other reason than the fact you didn't have information about its use?
In the development of a product stewardship initiative, it's a co-design process. I'm definitely not a scientist. I know it's a persistent organic pollutant, but I don't know what the alternatives are, if there are any alternatives. So I think I'll leave that to the experts to answer.
Any further questions? Would someone like to move? Councillor Benson-Pope, second to Councillor Staines. Do you wish to speak to this?
I do. In respect of that matter, and there may be others, I would like to see mention of methyl bromide because we know that it is a major damaging gas with human health issues as well. The use has previously been for fumigation of soil for strawberries, and the resistance of the industry delayed necessary steps to change practice over quite a long period, and we will all have read, I'm sure, of the problems associated with the lack of capture of methyl bromide in log fumigation processes at Port Nelson. I think fortunately, I don't think we have any, or I'm not aware of any such fumigation happening here, but I think support from all our communities for the proper use of methyl bromide, if it has to be used, or the sourcing of appropriate alternatives is something we should add our weight to, and I'd like to request an amendment to that effect.
So can I take it that in moving this, Councillor Benson-Pope, you are adding methyl bromide in your... Do you want to write a line to put in addition to... So obviously the recommended motion is approves the draft submission.
I just think methyl bromide should also be included as part of the product stewardship. Perhaps I could add that this is a welcome piece of just a welcome discussion. These issues have lagged for far too long. I think the comprehensive list of products that are identified is excellent and welcome, but I would just like to see that methyl bromide is included in that list for targeting.
Right, so that becomes part of the resolution. And you don't have any issues?
No issues at all.
Okay, further speakers. Councillor O'Malley.
I just would have thought it might be captured under agrochemicals and their uses, but does it need to be specifically named, or are we going to start listing every toxic chemical? It's a question, really.
The Ministry did list it separately, so I'm happy to address it as a separate. It also is used in containers of produce that are imported into New Zealand, so it's used there as well.
Councillor Vandervis.
If we're going to include methyl bromide in the list, and I have no objections to that, before we vote on it, perhaps could we have a quick explanation of what methyl bromide actually does, that it is essentially an ozone depleting gas, and that this would be the reason for including it in the product stewardship. Because not everybody knows what methyl bromide is. Well, it's come in a bit of a hurry.
Well, I thank you for answering your own question.
Do you think that's sufficient?
That's sufficient. I think that's very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Because I wasn't aware. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'll just speak to this briefly. This is a huge step forward for the way that we consider the waste streams in this country and how we tackle them. Since 2008, when the Waste Minimisation Act was passed, and I thank previous ministers for the environment and their support for that work, the minister has had the ability to declare priority products for mandatory product stewardship, which is a long-winded way of saying asking industry and business to play their part and pay their share of our community dealing with our zero waste ambitions. The minister has not chosen to take up that option since it was made available to them in 2008 until now. And so we haven't made as much progress in the interim. As great as our voluntary schemes have been, any voluntary scheme is never going to bring on board the worst offenders. And so I think tackling those here is helpful, and I think starting with the most toxic materials is entirely common sense. This council has made commitments to taking a more circular economy approach to our waste system, to being more ambitious around waste minimisation, but we can't do all of that ourselves. Whatever the suite of product stewardship schemes ends up looking like, they can only be helpful to us achieving what we are trying to achieve locally. So I commend I wasn't expecting the scope of products to be as broad as it has been, so I commend the ambition of the ministry and look forward to working with them as these different schemes develop over the next year or two. Thanks.
Wilson.
I echo those words and sentiments. I actually want to take the opportunity now to thank Kath Irvine, who has, as a staff member, has led the charge on this for years and has fed into the national conversations on this. It's a very heavy subject. I'd also like to note that I think it's one of the matters around this table that we've collectively unanimously agreed on, that we need to see this happen. I think genuinely people want to do the right thing, but they have to be given the method to do that, and I'm thrilled to see a government that's going to make that happen now. It saddens me when I see small AEA batteries sold for tuppence in order, which will last 5 minutes in a toy, and when thrown out to the environment, when there are so much better solutions around with recyclable batteries or rechargeable batteries and things. And this is the sort of leadership that the government hopefully will drive much better investment into recyclable and reusable materials, and it will make a huge difference. And I'm glad to see its time has finally come.
Councillor Staines.
I'm also extremely in favour of this direction. Finally, we have a government that is prepared to do something about it. I can remember back in the days at Fisher and Paykel, we were recovering our packaging, we were recovering our appliances and breaking those down and getting them into the right recycling. Industry wants to do this in many cases. It's just getting the politicians to step up and do it. And just on the subject of methyl bromide, it was phased out in the United States back in about 2005, and there are plenty of alternatives. So my view is it should actually be a banned substance in this country.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. Many of the points have been covered, but I just wanted to make the point that those of us who remember the days when and you have to be of a certain age, when you returned products for a monetary return, there's a real readiness for this. And I think the surprising thing and a very good thing about this submission is the complexity of it. And I think the community would be surprised at the complexity of it. Who would know that in each kind of category there are special criteria that are needed? I believe there is a real readiness in our community for such a scheme, and I want to just commend the team for the very thorough way that this has been prepared, the submission.
Further speakers? Councillor Benson-Pope, you're right to reply. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay. On to item 27, the submission on the Department of Conservation's proposed New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy. Welcome. Right, do you wish to introduce this or go straight to questions?
Go.
Okay. So questions, councillors. Item 27. Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you very much for this report. Thank you, Your Worship. I would just like to suggest, please, that point 7, which acknowledges partnership with Kaitahu, could it be moved up to point 2, please? And I don't know if this is pro forma or not for submissions, but I would just like to acknowledge, with the partnership with Kaitahu, acknowledge the passing of Tahu Pōtiki in the same month that the discussion document came out. Thank you.
Further questions? There are none. Would someone like to move it, please? Councillor Staines. Second to Councillor Gary. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Staines? Any further speakers? There being none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. That was quick. On to item 30, which is the next one on our agenda, as you recall, and this is also in the supplementary agenda. This is the Project China. Can I welcome up Wei Zhang and Mr. John Christie, Mr. Fraser Leggett, the whole team. Welcome. Wish to introduce to questions. Okay. Questions, Councillor. Councillor Gary. Oh, your mic's not on. That's it.
Hello. I wonder, gentlemen, if you could tell us there's no doubt that this relationship is a very important one, but could you tell us what you believe is the most useful and beneficial part or element to this relationship in terms of Dunedin's economy, in terms of real benefit?
Apologies about that. Obviously haven't been in here recently. There's several aspects to the report that set out I suppose the value to the city through this relationship in itself. It is hard to go past, I suppose, the contribution that international students make and a direct economic value add to the city. Chinese students still represent roughly close to about 1,000 students of nigh on 5,000 international students that are within the city, and the economic contribution that follows within that. The visitor spend is also significant in terms of visitors coming to the city, but there's other wider values and benefits that derive from the relationship and the work that we do through Project China, whether or not that's tied in with the Shanghai Science and Technology Commission, and the investment that comes with that, but more the value that comes from getting very clever people in China to work with very, very clever people in the institutions that we have in the university to develop programs around things such as non-communicable diseases.
So could I just ask you a further question on that, particularly in regard to the international students? What is your latest intelligence around how we are perceived as a place to welcome and care for our students who arrive from China.
I think the students from Shanghai, we warmly welcome them, and they are very important ambassadors when they go back to China. And every year, the students from Shanghai, I think they make a great contribution for our economy. So for all during the 2 months of the China students' holiday, they come here and they do research. They know more about our city, and their parents also come here. So there are lots of students converted from the students and the parents to the permanent students. That's in our city. We work with all the related parties to welcome them, and I think Dunedin is getting more and more popular. Thank you.
Can I just add to that answer and note what I observed when I was last in China, because I attended 2 University of Otago 150th anniversary alumni events, one in Shanghai and one in Beijing. And it's not, the benefit of the city is not confined to the students that come here and what they spend or don't. It's not confined even to the research collaborations which are growing. It also extends to the influence that our alumni, Chinese alumni, have when they go back to China. I was amazed at the number of Chinese alumni that attended those events and were so enthusiastic and are maintaining their contacts and indeed growing them into business contacts with New Zealand and with Dunedin as a result, and building up our reputation. So the benefit of the initial educational connections extends out to when they've graduated and gone back into business or other professions in China. Councillor Vandervis, you had a question.
Given that alumni influence is hard to quantify, and that we have been putting a very large amount of resource and extraordinary number of trips to China over recent years, the easily quantifiable number is the number of students that come here, and I believe that's about 900, and I believe that it hasn't changed much over quite some number of years. Given that there's been no significant increase despite the significant investment, why is it that we keep pouring this kind of investment into China? Is it because of the influence factors that are harder to quantify? And why is it that despite all these visits, we don't see bigger Chinese student numbers coming here?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We do have a number of different ways that we look to attract students into the city. A lot of what we're doing is working on what we'd call short-term educational visits, which, as Jung Wei has said, often turn into long-term study opportunities at our tertiary institutions. Those short-term study opportunities are tangibly measured by, and they're in the report, in terms of the monetary contribution they bring into the city. I think the figure's around $1.5 million New Zealand. So there is a direct correlation between the work that we're doing in the China market, attracting those short-term students into the city. What we can't measure so easily long-term is the impact that that has on the tertiary student market, but we know there is definitely a pathway for those students coming into the city, and one which we wish to continue to actively pursue. The other angle around the education sector is we're starting to see more and more activity at a research level, and that again is something that's quite hard for us to measure in the short term, but we know that the Science and Technology Commission agreement that we've signed, we've now got 2 research projects underway in Shanghai as a result of that. That work has come directly as a result of the work that Enterprise Dunedin and the DCC has done in signing up to that agreement. That will take some time for us to be able to see the benefits in economic terms.
I think the other thing, Councillor, to appreciate is that over time the visits to China, whether they're by staff or mayoral delegations, have broadened their focus. So whereas we might have been focusing only or largely on educational links in the past, I note that the kinds of MOUs we're signing now and the kinds of organisations and entities that we're interacting with has broadened out. So it's not just about education anymore, which is a sign of the growth of the maturity of the relationship, I guess. Further questions? Councillor Steadman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Would it be fair to say the cost of going over to China versus the income that's coming in will be pretty good return on the investment? Yes. Thank you.
Councillor Lord.
I've got a question, and it's not in any way with dismay with our investment in China, but do we ever think that we should be putting a similar amount of money into Australia? I just wonder if the returns there could be good. It's closer, they're a large trading partner anyway, and I just wonder if you ever thought about the benefits of looking into Australia as well, especially in view of our airport connection. Very good question, Councillor. We've set up Project China under the Greater Dunedin Partnership program of work that was undertaken. That's a project that's now about 4 years into development. It was set up as a template to look at how we could internationalise some of our work, and given that we'd had a sister city relationship with Shanghai, it was deemed by the Greater Dunedin partners that was a relationship that we wished to pursue more economically to see how we could derive additional benefit. I think given the success that that program has had, we are casting our minds to where we might be able to use the lessons that we've learnt from having a very a dedicated resource and dedicated thinking around a program of work to see how that might work with other countries. Australia is one that obviously is on our radar for further work to be done.
Councillor Newell. Oh, you did. Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks for this report. Can you answer me the question, how many students are we getting from North America versus the number of students we're getting from China?
Actually, about 800 from North America.
And that's more passive then, is it not? Because we don't have an activity in North America to bring those students in.
That's correct.
Cool. And does the university have any record of the number of research agreements it's operating into North America and to Europe compared to the ones in China?
I don't have that information to hand, I'm afraid, in terms of the numbers.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Councillor Wilson.
Two questions. One is understanding the culture of China and doing business in China. And am I correct in believing that it's very much at a level of personal relationships, and it's important to keep the relationships going, and that that's one of the cultural differences that we probably have compared to having relationships with American students?
That's correct.
Second question is, I'm intrigued by a lot of discussion here today about costs, and I'm going to embarrass one of my colleagues, but I'd like to check my facts before I ask them, before I make a statement. And am I correct in believing that the Deputy Mayor has a tendency to attend these meetings but pays for his own way, both on airfare and accommodation, in order to ensure that those relationships continue at the highest level?
Yeah, that is correct.
I'd just like to note that round the table and to ensure that that's on record, because I think it's really important to understand the contribution that is made, and sometimes we want to talk about costs without actually understanding them, and instead of valuing the contributions made by some people around this table.
Councillor Gary.
I just had a further question about what we do in terms of the work we do in terms of attracting the international students from North America, some of the initiatives that are ongoing, because even though we haven't got a dedicated project, is it true that we do a number of, we receive delegations and have a number of initiatives?
This is one of those moments where I wish I had Ms. Reid from my team here. But we work very, very closely with the university and especially the international office in regards to activities in terms of promoting Dunedin as a study destination. More recently, we've just had a FMIL out from the United States, which provided an opportunity to showcase the city and the opportunities here for international students from North America as well.
I guess my follow-up question is, are you aware that some of the agents who are on that FML actually wanted to move to Dunedin?
I had heard that, and that was very, very positive.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you. Just a question about developing business and investment activities. And I know that quite a few Dunedin businesses look to China for getting parts. So parts for, say, a machine they're making. And quite often quality and consistency is really important. And having a contact in China or Shanghai to actually negotiate those with the companies over there. Is there any development or thought of development of that kind of thing?
I think there are lots of companies from our Dunedin to buy something or to do business with China. We work with Chamber of Commerce to provide the right platform. I can give you a very short example. There's a company who would like to buy the kitchen stuff. So through our relationship, we introduce them to the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce. Then the Shanghai Chamber hosts the company and help them to look for the right thing. So this is a platform we build, Chamber, and we work with the Chamber to build the strong platform to share the knowledge, to share the relationship. So I think our Dunedin company get benefit from this relationship. Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, if there are none, would someone like to move? Councillor Staines, second to Councillor Gary. Councillor Staines, do you wish to speak to this?
It's good to have this report before us. I think one of the issues that has come over the years is we too often sit on the bushel and don't actually put out there what is going on. Certainly, there appears to be a lot of trips, but of those trips, there are a variety. So you have the civic visit, which would be at a high level. So if the Mayor goes to China, then you will meet with the highest level people in the businesses that you have arranged a visit with. And then there is the visits that staff do, which are the visits that will get more traction on the ground. They will meet because the head of the business has said, yes, we want to interact. Then permission is given to the next layer in the company to actually talk about what will happen. So what we see in here is a series of steps that ends up with a memorandum of understanding being signed and then the work coming from that. And what I've noticed over the years is that that rate is increasing. And in fact, we've reached a point, I think now, where we can pick and choose a little on what areas we want to focus our attention on and which ones are an opportunity that perhaps should go somewhere else. So this is, it has really delivered an amazing amount. I think my first visit to China was with Fisher and Paykel and then with the Chamber back in about 1998, somewhere about there. So I've followed this relationship for a long time, and I think it's providing significant value to our community. And I think if we look at it, I suspect it's doing this. So the amount of benefit we get is climbing quite rapidly.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to take the time to acknowledge the staff who have worked extremely hard in this particular area and the benefits that they have got for our city, and also to acknowledge you, Your Worship, and Deputy Mayor Staines for the many trips that you have made where you have got incredible traction for our city. I believed I understood the depth of the relationship until I went up there to represent the city at a Sister City Tourism Conference, and I was astounded. I was astounded because of the depth of the relationship. I was astounded because we are held in such high regard amongst other countries that are much bigger and other countries that have apparently more influence. We are a small city. And there are many other cities that have relationships with, in particular, Shanghai. It was the mana of Dunedin that was upheld by our Mayor and Deputy Mayor when they were there. I also acknowledge the Chamber of Commerce and the work they've done up there in conjunction with the Council. And I note that we're using the lessons learnt up in Shanghai in relation to Edinburgh, and some great work going on in the background around developing those relationships with Edinburgh for the benefit of the city. So I just want to note thanks for all the work done in the background, and it's great to see that summarised in a report.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you very much for this report. It certainly does result. It is the result of obviously a lot of work. My question, or my observation and long-term sort of concern about this is the actual return on investment relative to where we are passively getting economic return. So that's why I brought up the North American students as an example. We aren't really putting much effort in there, and yet the numbers are quite similar. I'm also looking at something like the universities themselves, asking, would they not be the appropriate agent to be doing this rather than the city, given that they are in fact the industry in which they're working in. And I guess what I would like to see is, in fact, good strong data to underpin the effort that we're putting in here. So we're seeing what are the changes in the numbers of students coming in, how many memorandums of understanding have converted to actual contracts, and what is the GDP effect of this? Because I don't doubt at all that this is a very important cultural exchange program, and I do believe it has value. So I'm not saying that there's no value here, but I am saying this. To what extent is this an economic exchange, and to what extent is it a cultural exchange? And as our reports go forward, I'd like those two headers to be considered, because it's not unimportant to have a cultural exchange that can have later on a much stronger underpinning of economic return. But if we are doing economic exchanges, then that's what I would consider maybe we are dealing with our biggest trading partner, Australia. We had 7 or 6 American senators come through on a trade exploration trip, and I think that maybe we want to be considering some of these other places and looking at the investment and return on investment when it comes to trade specifically. Thank you.
Councillor Vanderkis.
I'd like to echo Councillor O'Malley's distinction between the economic and the cultural value of international exchange. I agree there's no doubt that a high-level building of relationships between this council and between the chambers of commerce here and in China has significant cultural connection and effects. But as somebody who has for decades been an importer from China and Taiwan, and in fact I think I'm still a registered customs clearance agent and have quite a bit of experience in the actual business of doing business with China, I think that the economic aspects of all these trips to China has been vastly overplayed. And my experience of dealing with China is that the Chinese will deal with absolutely anybody at short notice simply to get a product out the door. The dealing direct with Chinese companies at any scale is quite possible for any business here in Dunedin, especially with the internet these days, telegraphic transfers and others being very easy ways of moving funds around. And the idea that somehow a business here has to go through our Chamber of Commerce to connect with their Chamber of Commerce to get a business deal, rather than actually adding value, it's liable to add cost at both ends. And I have found that the companies I deal with are keen to cut out the middlemen, the Chambers of Commerce, and actually deal direct. They're interested in the money, they're interested in getting the money out the door, the product out the door. And I think that in terms of the commercial returns from our investment in China, I would like to echo Councillor Lord's suggestion that they are potentially much better in a near-market, similar culture country like Australia. And not to forget that we have cultural relationships with the Australians as well. They play a kind of football that apparently we sort of quite enjoy and understand. But in terms of our investment, essentially of ratepayers' money, in other relationships with other countries, I think we need to be quite aware and make the distinction, as Councillor O'Malley has, between what cultural values there are, and there may be some spillover, and the hard cash issues that come with dealing with China. And those, I believe, are best dealt with companies directly.
Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Worship, and thank you very much for the report. I'd just like to make it very, very clear that our discussion today in no way demeans what has gone before, and I think I would like to pay tribute also to our Deputy Mayor who's been paying his own way to get over there. Those relationships, I'm sure, are very, very important to us and are showing some fruits. I think what we're talking about here today is how we get the best bang for our marketing dollar, and is that still in the Chinese market, with the tourism boom being over officially and carbon charges going through the roof. Long-haul travel is going to be more difficult for everyone. We've also got an international flight out at the International Airport Momona that we need to protect and encourage as much as we can. If we lose that international destination, and we won't get it back. So I think it's just a case of acknowledging the work that has been done. That was right then, and we can't always do what we've always done.
Further speakers? Well, as you'll have noticed, I signed off the introduction to this, so I'll make some comments to this report. So I'll make some comments. The first is going back to when we developed, I think we've put a couple of things together here over several years. Going back to when we developed our economic development strategy, we identified that the future for Dunedin businesses was likely to be coming out of the outputs of the university and the polytechnic, i.e. research output and graduates. And that goes into the kinds of businesses that we're seeing really taking off in Dunedin, like IT businesses, design, some medical-based businesses. And the thing that most of them have in common is an international perspective. You either need investors from overseas or markets overseas or employees from overseas in many cases. And we put that together fortuitously because we'd had a relationship with Shanghai since 1994 and married the two up. And hence the importance of the polytechnic and the university in our relationships with China. Someone around the table mentioned that why didn't the university do it on its own because it's their business. They've expressed to us their appreciation of the fact that mayoral delegations open doors for them and actually set up the relationships. And I've done pitches in China to organisations like the Shanghai Education Commission or the Chinese Scholarship Council with and for the university. And they find that's very, very useful for them, and it's very productive for our city. In terms of there's been some mention of it being a cultural relationship and whether it can be moved to an economic one. I think it's already well and truly moved to an economic one. In fact, the relationship didn't start as cultural, it started as civic. And it morphed a little into the cultural sphere when Shanghai basically paid for our Chinese garden, yuan. And it has moved into the economic much more, but not direct to council, but to the university, to the polytechnic, where the polytechnic now is taking groups of, for instance, teachers from places like Qingyuan, so it's spread out beyond Shanghai, and they're being paid to do short-term courses for these considerable groups. These tens of thousands of dollars that are coming into the city, that is an economic advantage. We've got investment from Shanghai in research programs in the University of Otago. That's economic benefit coming in from China. So the benefit is already well and truly economic for this city. And I think, if anything, the potential is in the cultural side. So my last trip, we visited the Forbidden City and some museums and were asked about the possibility of hosting touring exhibitions. So I think there's enormous potential culturally. Going to the comments that Councillor Vandervis made about the nature of Chinese business, I think it's actually naive to think that relationships with Chinese business people are just transactional. They're not. Of course anyone will sell you anything, but they won't buy or co-invest anything without a relationship. That's the point. And we're not only interested in buying, we're obviously interested in selling and getting co-investment. And that's where the investment in Project China, which is probably in total less than we put into marketing tourism in the city. It's what we spend on Chinese interaction is peanuts compared with some of the other stuff. But I completely agree with those who've suggested that we can explore possibilities elsewhere, and we are. The latest one was we managed to leverage the sister city relationship with Edinburgh to get an enormous benefit for our upcoming Centre of Digital Excellence project. So it again reinforces the virtue and the benefit of leveraging existing sister city agreements, in this case, sister city relationships for the benefit of the city. And we've certainly been hugely successful in China. And I think some of the comments that you saw from the Consul General in Shanghai and one or two other people, and I know that around the country, Dunedin is perceived as having the most productive and the most beneficial relationship with any Chinese city. So I think we've done really well. Can I ask Councillor Staines if you'd like to exercise your right of reply?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just maybe making some comments on, a bit further comment on relationships. The comment was made that you can just buy anything, just get online and buy it out of China. And you can. And I have a brother who regularly buys stuff. 50% of what he gets doesn't work. 50% dies after a short period of time. What comes with a relationship, and this was underpinned from my days at Fisher and Paykel, is when you have a relationship that has built confidence between the supplier and the purchaser, then you get the quality you expect. So this relationship, and I think it applies for more than just buying and selling goods. It also applies to relationships and education. When you are trusted at the highest level in your relationship, then you get doors opening that you wouldn't otherwise, and you get the benefits from that. Even to the extent of, we can't afford to bring a whole lot of high-level people to New Zealand, but Shanghai can, China can, for things like the Chinese Import Expo. There is where we met a couple of people from the UK that opened doors into that gaming come software business. So there's all sorts of relationship links that come from the relationship with China and Shanghai. So I would like to think that future councils will continue to work that relationship, but I accept there are other markets that we could look at, and I think we need to be strategic in that. I'm not sure that just focusing on Australia will bring us what we want, but there are other markets that are emerging that could bring us great benefit. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you, team. Now I'm going to move from the chair that we have a brief recess, 5-minute recess. Seconded Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
We'll come back in 5 to 3. Well, we'll get underway again, councillors. We're on to item 28, 2019 annual reports for Dunedin City Holdings. Can I welcome Mr Cooper and Ms Adams to speak to their reports? Welcome. Keith. Do you wish to? You can probably lose one of those if you don't need three. Go straight to.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I propose just to step briefly through each company. I assume that everyone's obviously had the papers and had a chance to look at the detail, so I don't intend to repeat the detail. So first up, Dunedin Railways Limited. Their audited accounts have yet to be signed off. We expect that any day, which does put us in a breach of the Local Government Act, having missed yesterday, principally caused by it being left to last on the basis that it was immaterial. It won't have an impact on the DCHL accounts, and it also Audit New Zealand was short of staff, so that's what's caused what's going to be a couple of days delay. That said, we've seen the draft accounts, not the audited. They've had a series of weather events over recent years. They've got a challenging maintenance environments, both in tracks and tunnels. Therefore, they've put a request to the shareholders to convert debt to equity, which DCHL has done via DCTL. So we've injected 700,000 and OETT have converted their 300,000 to debt. The company is currently working on a new sustainability plan, focusing on 4 key legs of how they can preserve the iconic attraction of the Dunedin Railways to Dunedin. We intend to get an economic analysis done in due course to underpin further analysis of a way forward for Dunedin Rail. So it's business as usual. They're coming into the cruise season. It is a seasonal business. They burn a lot of cash in the winter months, and they make their money from October through to March each year. Worth noting they've adopted a living wage, which you'll have seen publicised. So their result was somewhat minimalistic, of a loss of just under 200,000 for the year. So outlook-wise, we see it as being relatively challenging for that business, depending on what their sustainability plan is. Moving to Aurora Energy, they had a loss of 7 million, an operating loss of 7 million. In addition, they had a 5 million provision for the Commerce Commission penalties. Their equity ratio is sitting at 31%. The network is performing, aside from the planned outages. The capital program is on target. The capex that they're undertaking arguably would have happened over a large number of years, so the issue is one of really timing. So the capital expenditure needed done, it had been deferred, the debt would have arisen over a longer period of time, and they would have had a return on that investment. So as much as we're fronting and loading a lot now, or you could say back-end loading, it was money that was always going to have to be spent, and those charges would have always been passed on to consumers. They are embarking on a CPP process, currently in consultation. The Commerce Commission will deliver its first outcome of that in May 2020, with implementation of that new pathway in April 2021. Worth noting that they are one of the 4, they're in the lowest 4 of charges to retailers of electricity. There's also a debate how much of any charge, any increase that they are allowed from the Commerce Commission, how that manifests in increased power charges at consumer level, given that there's retailers who will have differing aspirations as to margin. The nub of the challenge they're having at present is that they're gaining little return on their quite considerable investment. They spent circa 60 million last year on capex, another 70 million this year, and in the coming year that's meant to be at similar levels. That's currently covered under the old DPP regime, which is reset every 5 years. There's currently a reset going on at present. So the investment they made over the last 2 years, they're getting a very minimal return on. It'll be overtaken by the CPP in 2021. So this all means that next year is probably going to be, or will be, worse for Aurora, with a forecast recovery in 2021 and thereafter. I touched on the Commerce Commission penalty for their outages issues in 15, 16, 17 and 18. They've provisioned $5 million based on discussions with the Commerce Commission. We anticipate that the statement of facts being agreed and put before the courts in the first quarter of next year for sanctioning, and that's when payment will be triggered. Some of their challenges, they've currently got 11 vacancies in their crew. That's down from circa 30 a year ago. 5 of those are senior people, and they are struggling to fill those level of vacancies, principally because the whole sector in New Zealand is short of the skilled people and the seniority of those people to fill vacancies. So it's a highly competitive market. And we do have challenges about meeting the market for those types of people we're looking for. That said, the outlook is positive, and I say that in 2021 because we are going to have to grin and bear another year of what will be a worse result than this year for Aurora. Dunedin Stadium property, it's going according to plan. It's really a holding entity for the stadium, obviously. It's done slightly better than this year, given the lower interest rates have reduced its cost of operating. So outlook for that is neutral. DVML, small profit reflecting the costs of attracting and running events. However, in our view, the DVML delivers a lot of economic and social benefits to the Dunedin community. So we see the outlook for them as being positive in the coming year and beyond. Delta had an after-tax profit of $1.9 million and equity ratio of 37%. It did underperform the budget, and we are working with the company on getting confidence that they can restore their operating performance to budgeted levels. Their key challenges are around timing of contract works, and that's something that we are told is being resolved. Living wage will be a burden to that company. They have a number of people that are under that level, and they do a lot of contract work, which will be a challenge. Yaldhurst, the investment that was the conversion of debt, the funds are being released ahead of plan and are looking positively to go further ahead of plan in the coming months. So outlook for Delta is stable and if not improving. Dunedin Airport, profit after tax was $3.6 million, equity ratio of 67%, record numbers through the airport in the current year, just short of 1.2 million people. They have invested in the car park and terminal, given that it is an entrance or gateway and exit from Dunedin, so they're very focused on ensuring visitors have as best experience as possible for an airport. They're also leading the Lower South Island collaborative strategy amongst other tourism sectors to attract people to the Lower South Island. So outlook for them is positive. City Forests, profit after tax is $25.2 million, equity ratio of 72%. They've had a very strong year. Notwithstanding there's been some market volatility, it has corrected, and they've conservatively forecast a similar position in the coming year. They added 1,000 hectares to their portfolio during the year. Again, outlook for City Forests is positive. DCTL, the Treasury function, currently managing a portfolio of $691 million. Cost of funds was 3.93%, with a reduction of interest for the year of $5 million compared to the previous year on a like-for-like basis. We are taking a bank approach to how we lend to subsidiaries, how we manage the ratios, and how we look after the debt that the companies are incurring. The Waipori Fund achieved its objectives, both in terms of growth and revenue and delivery back to the shareholder in the past year. So the outlooks for Dunedin City Treasury, given what it does, cost of funds are looking to be stable, if not lower. So that all rolls up to the DCHL group, 10.4 million pre-tax profit. We have an equity ratio of 32%, assets of 1.35 billion, with the market value estimated to be significantly higher if those assets were sold, excluding the stadium. Those operating entities have 384 million of debt. Positive cash flow of 31.6 million for the year. In terms of operating, the activities we undertook, we replaced 7 directors on boards in the current year. We are working with 3 companies on more of a micro level in terms of performance, and we are focusing on what the subs do compared and how they perform versus sector versus other sectors, competitors, and ascertaining what future those subsidiaries should or could have in terms of benefit or relevance to the DCC. So we're taking a more inquisitive approach so we can better advise the ultimate shareholder, being the DCC, as to the benefits of these entities, or indeed if there's other opportunities which would also deliver different or better benefits to Dunedin. I would highlight, and I won't go through it, draw your attention to page 6 of our annual report, which focuses on our health and safety, page 7 for environmental initiatives, and page 8 for community involvements, all key pillars which we undertook to deliver as a result of council feedback in past years in terms of what we do in a non-monetary sense, but more community relevant and looking after our people. We believe we've met the letter of expectation requirements, particularly around remuneration of our various subsidiaries' senior team, and we believe generally, with 1 or 2 exceptions, we've met the terms of our statements of intents. So again, we're looking at a relatively stable and as forecast position in the coming 3 years, with the challenges principally being around Delta meeting budget and Dunedin Railways recovery plan. That sort of summarise what is somewhat many pages you no doubt had in front of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Can I throw it open to questions, councillors? Councillor Lord.
Hey, Keith, could I just ask about the intern program? Just your comments on the, well, you've already told us in briefings a bit, but can you give us a comment about the interns you've had the first lot and their either success or non-success, and then also just how you're looking for the new year?
And I draw your attention to page 9. That was the 4th pillar of what we're doing for the greater good. The one challenge we've had, it may have been misunderstood, as it can be, is that the interns possibly thought it was a fast track to obtaining directorships on DCHL-owned companies, which was unfortunate. It certainly wasn't represented like that, but it perhaps was interpreted like that. So whilst in one instance someone was successful, in many other cases people weren't successful, thinking that that was a fast track approach. So we were pleased with the program. The companies enjoyed, I'd say it delivered a different level of diversity, and I'd say that level of that diversity was more age demographics. And so the companies all experienced people probably, I better be careful here, probably sub 40 and their views around the table, which they enjoyed. And certainly the interns got a lot from it. We just need to be clear that it's not a fast track process for appointment. It has been repeated, relaunched. We're currently advertising for new interns at present.
Councillor Gary.
I have a follow-up question to that. Do you have any idea if the interns had success in getting directorships on other boards following their internships?
I should have added, we have created an alumni where we will be working with the interns on on an alumni basis. I'm not sure if 1 or 2 may have done something else. I'm not totally up to speed with it.
Another question. It's my understanding that the affordability ratio and gearing ratio are a really good way to see how things are progressing. How are those 2 ratios tracking?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
I was asking a question about the affordability ratio and the gearing ratio. I understand that those are a good way to see how things are tracking in economic terms. How would you say those were progressing, tracking?
The gearing of Treasury is one measure, and we're probably saying that's okay. Affordability-wise, we're not currently tracking that.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Worship. I do just want to make a quick comment around the question that Councillor Gary asked, because as Chair of Volunteering Otago, we took on one of the interns, and she has been very good, very strong, and I would try and encourage any, especially non-profit around the city, to engage with these interns, because their skill set is quite exceptional. The question I do have, Mr. Cooper, Can you just reiterate the figures for me? You said the assets of the companies was 3.5 billion excluding the stadium?
Oh, 1.35.
1.35?
Including the stadium.
1.35 including the stadium?
Yes.
And a debt of 384 million?
On the operating entities excluding the stadium.
Further questions? Councillor Elder.
Just something that I have an interest in and was requesting an emphasis on, and that is recruiting and training local people and creating jobs for and training for local people. Where's that tracking?
Most of the companies, well certainly Delta identified they've got 38 apprenticeships currently running, or 34, sorry. That's across the group. It's something that's it's happening out there. It will be potentially a little bit of a challenge. I'm not saying this is the company's position, but of course those people will have to be at living wages now as well, which apprenticeships in the community are generally not at that rate. So the companies are aware of it. The market availability is dictating it anyway, where people are adopting more training because they can't get skilled people. So underlying it's happening without being a specific program.
Councillor Van der Vis.
The Aurora accounts, do they assume that the Commerce Commission application will be accepted?
Yes. That said, there's no specific application in terms of, there's a process that they go through for the CPP process, and the inserted, it's all by agreement or by dictated from the Commerce Commission. So there's no numbers that have been agreed. It's the process that's been agreed.
And when will we know those numbers?
The first Commerce Commission's determination is in April 20 May 20 for implementation April 21.
You highlighted the challenges in Delta and Dunedin Railways, which is small bananas really. What really frightens me is Aurora. We learned after the annual plan this year that Aurora planned to lose $33.8 million in the next 2 years. And it would seem now that there's going to be further loss going into 2021, where that total loss is now going to be $44.7 million. Is that your understanding as well?
There's an unfortunate process that we have to embark on, and that the first SOIs are having to be furnished, I think, in February, which preempts the all companies' budgeting round. So they're very much placeholders. So we delivered that, and at a subsequent workshop when the final SOIs had to be in, I think was in June, got their budgeted numbers for the next 3 years, which were hard numbers. So I wouldn't say they changed it. They were refined because the prior numbers were holding numbers. So your numbers, I think, are correct off the top of my head for the next 3 years.
All right, okay, and thank you for being upfront with those. Regarding group debt, is it true that the latest numbers have come through about $33 million worse than the previous figures we had? Talking about something like $803 million now.
I wouldn't say worse, they're higher because various entities, including the DCC, have requested additional funding to meet their own capital expenditure programs.
Right, but the higher levels,
they're high.
33 million, other than what we were talking about only a few months ago, now somewhere in the region of 803, is that your understanding?
My understanding is it's higher than that.
Even higher than that?
Yes, as a group.
So as a group, what do you put it at?
Oh, sorry, it depends which term you're looking at, forecasts, and how far you're looking out. The current year, it'll be in the next financial year, it's forecast to be higher. In the current year, where in the current financial year, it's in that vicinity. We're looking at a 3-year horizon for that program.
Thank you, and thank you also for being very clear in explaining the different contributions from different companies. The forest doing well Waipori doing very well and very much appreciative of that. But really the elephant in the room being Aurora and Delta to a lesser extent. I do wonder when these figures are just going to stop getting bigger. Do you have any feeling for going forward when the bleeding is going to stop?
Yeah, highly confident now of the 2021 position. It's been an iterative process with the regulator getting independent reviews done, which have then required additional expenditure. They've now had the benefit of a good 2 years of developing, critiquing and finalising their asset management plan. So I would say here now that we're pretty certain on their debt level forecasts. We're uncertain on their revenue forecast pending Commerce Commission outcomes. So we see that as being it. I would stress, however, that the type of assets they're spending on, their revenue producing assets to a level, and they're also going to be long-term assets which must underpin the value of an electricity lines company. So they're not sunk or wasted costs. They're going to be long-term investments as opposed to a cost, and we see that as improving their asset base of the company in the future, which must underpin the value.
So confident that the $5 million that you've put aside for the fine, that is not going to escalate? Do you have confirmation of that, or is that a placeholder as well that might alter?
It reflects the ongoing dialogue we've had with the Commerce Commission. None of us can be certain, given that the High Court are the ones that ultimately decide. The process is that both parties have a statement of facts. They have agreed what they see as a fair penalty collectively, and they ask the court to rubber stamp that or not, potentially. So it's the best knowledge we have. We don't, based on the dialogue we've had with the Commerce Commission, we don't see that being too far wrong.
Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins. Any further questions? Councillor O'Malley.
It's more or less a summary question around Aurora. Would it be fair to say that basically the debt that it is taking on is going to effectively leave it in an asset-rich position later, and that with those better assets going to the Commerce Commission, it will basically have greater income coming in, and when you look at the whole lot coming together, that Aurora is in a safe place?
I concur with your last summary comment. The previous detailed pieces I wouldn't like to comment on.
They'll have to play out. But
they'll have to play out.
But effectively, Aurora is in a safe place.
Yes, it is.
And I guess for the ratepayer of Dunedin, Aurora is the lines provider, and you've touched on it already. There will be an expectation of lines charges that go up as this goes all the way through, but Aurora itself is not in any danger, so therefore the exposure of the citizens of the city or the ratepayers of the city will be in the form of the lines charges, but it won't be in the form of a major CCO defaulting or becoming insolvent.
It's not on our horizon. I think I noted the equity position of the company was high 30 or mid 30s. I would just add the key determinant of value for Aurora, particularly given it's a regulated organisation, will be what the regulator allows it to earn on its investments.
Councillor Garrity.
Mr Cooper, I wonder if you could comment on the thought that for the community, the ratepayer, the complexities as you described them in your answer to Councillor Vandervis and to Councillor O'Malley are not well understood.
And hence the company is currently involved and will continue to be involved in quite a substantive campaign, consultative process with the community, not only to get feedback as part of their Commerce Commission application, but also to give the community a chance to understand what it's all about. It won't necessarily appeal to everybody. What will appeal is the bill for power in their account. But nonetheless, the company is very aware of and is embarking on a very extensive campaign.
Further questions? Councillor Lord. Councillor Lord, you move. If there are no further questions, seconded Councillor Hall. Councillor Lord, do you wish to speak to this?
Well, I would just make the comment that I think when we came in 2016, we didn't know the full extent of this. There was money budgeted, I think at the time, 417 million or something for Aurora to spend. There was letters from the DCHL board saying, why aren't you spending this money? It has subsequently become apparent that there was more money that needed spent. I think we're in the unenviable task where we have to deal with a problem that's not necessarily of our own making. And I think since 2016, we've split Aurora and Delta. We've had an independent review done before that by Deloitte's. There's been 2 new boards. There's significant new directors, and we have, well, I have confidence, we've heard the answers here, but I have confidence that we are going in the right direction. I'm reasonably confident when I look at the valuations, as Mr Cooper did say, that if you were putting the companies on the market, the valuations doesn't necessarily reflect the price you will receive, and particularly in the case of, you know, a company like City Forest, I think we'd get a considerably better value than what it's written at on the box. So just thank Mr Cooper and thank you for the work you do, and thank you for the opportunities.
Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Your Worship. I tend to agree that we've been in the position of mopping up a lack of maintenance for many moons with Aurora, and so we are sort of recovering from past sins. But it's a case of not having a cake and eating it too. You can't moan that the poles are dangerous and the asset is being degraded, and then when they upgrade it and invest, you can't moan that that's creating debt, because we know that debt is going to be serviced over a long period of time, and it is going to leave the asset in a damn sight better place. So I support this too, and I'd like to thank Keith and Gemma for their work.
Councillor Vandevers.
Having been here a very long time, the idea that this has somehow snuck up onto us and we haven't had prior warnings, especially of Aurora, has not been my experience. Going right back to 2004, 2007, my discussions with the Chief Executive of Delta, and it was Delta Aurora basically then, Mr John Walsh, revealed that already then there were significant issues with the fact that the 2 companies weren't separated, that deals were being done within them to make them both look good, that maintenance was already a problem then, that being able to get information from the companies was nigh on impossible. I couldn't even get information regarding what the companies had paid, for instance, for the lighting system at Carisbrook. There were a whole lot of issues where the council, for whatever reason, chose to believe that they'd done what they needed to do by putting directors in place, and that there was little or no oversight and no will to have an oversight on supposedly council-controlled companies. When we had an applicant for the chief executive position some time ago who had issues in a North Island city with its council-controlled companies, she characterised the issues that she had there and believed that they were similar here as not having council-controlled companies, but having council-controlling companies. And I believe that we still have a culture where sufficient oversight is not being maintained on the companies, where certainly we have to repair the massive maintenance backlog, especially in Aurora, but that even now, those monies spent are not being well spent in many cases. There has been an exceedingly poor oversight of the pole replacement program. The level of productivity in Aurora actually making gains with the extraordinary amount of money that they are having to plough in every year is extremely worrying and low, and that what this next council has to do is it has to have a much closer look and a much closer scrutiny at companies that for years now have paid us no dividend, don't intend paying us any dividend, and in the case of Aurora are going to lose us $44 million in the next 3 years. These are hard, uncomfortable facts, and no amount of looking on the bright side is going to change the fact that the council companies that should be giving us healthy dividends with which to run the city are simply racking up masses of debt and trying to staunch what has been a long bloodletting of inefficiency and low productivity. I believe that under Mr. Cooper we are getting now a much better view of what the council companies are doing, and I very much appreciate the candour and the detail that is now coming forth from the companies. I'm hoping that that and a new interest by the new council will actually see a culture change where the companies recognise what they're actually there for and that they deliver it. Thank you for hearing me out.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper and Ms. Adams, I wanted to draw attention to some things that are not around the economics. It's been well covered off, and I appreciate all of the detail in this report and the very clear indication. A view of "I told you so" is not helpful at this time. This has been a painful time for us, trying to get on top of the Aurora issues, and I thank you for walking us through that and for making it very clear about what we're doing, what we need to do, and and forward thinking on all of the companies and that oversight. But I want to draw your attention to the environmental initiatives, which I have always been frustrated that we didn't really have as much detail as I was keen to have, and this is very pleasing to see, the amount of detail in that. Also the community involvement, and I particularly wanted to mention the Delta's Charity Challenge. I thought that was particularly creative, a great initiative. All of this engages the community and in a very positive way. The health and safety was a particularly pleasing aspect to see in terms of progress in that and keeping our people safe. And the living wage following through on that, important too. But I particularly want to mention something that I have certainly asked, and I know my colleague Councillor Ulafiso has drawn attention to over the Trainium, and that's around working towards diversity on the boards, and in particular gender balance. And I appreciate and note the progress made in that area, and the work with interns clearly a really positive step. So thank you for your work, both of you, and for the leadership shown, Mr. Cooper.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. I concur with a lot of what Councillor Gary has just said. I guess, you know what, having come up 6 years on council, and I think about when the early days of 2013-14, when we started dealing with the companies, we've actually come a long, long way, in my opinion. When I think of the skill set and the structure around the companies, the directors we have now are world class. They are the best in New Zealand. We're getting good, really good recruitments. And I think it's really frustrating at times to hear some of our directors on our boards consistently getting criticised. When you go through their CVs and resumes and you see the skill set they're bringing to the table for us and for the community and for our companies, we're very lucky to have them. Yes, there could be a gender balance at times, but the key thing is we're getting really good skill set. And the companies are heading in the right direction. I would love to sit back in 1995 and look at Aurora and say, wow, we should be investing money in that. We are paying for what previous councils and company board members or whatever didn't do. Let's move forward, let's invest in the companies, let's set up so we have a great and very strong company. Because when it's all said and done, Aurora is going to be a very strong company in 3 or 4 years' time. Yes, a lot of work has to be done, but so are the rest of the companies. We just have to go out to the airport to see what is happening, the growth, and how that is being led. We have to look at city forests and how they have grown and the dividends they are returning. Not everything's always going to be great, but we actually do have a very good structure here, and we should be thanking those involved for that structure, and thank Mr. Cooper and Ms. Adams for the work that they do.
The speakers. Well, I'm very pleased to receive these reports. As Councillor Vandervis said, they are rich on detail. They're more transparent, and there's a rich vein of candour, as Councillor Vandervis said, right through them all. I do think it's a matter sometimes of whether you look at the glass half full or the glass half empty, and what I do agree with Councillor Vandervis on is that this didn't snuck up on us. We have known for some years, since I came into the mayoralty, it's been increasingly obvious and made very obvious what was happening. And it didn't, and the hard facts are that throughout the period since we had a renewed board, if you recall, we disestablished the board, we put a temporary board in and they straightened things out, and then we put a permanent board in place under Mr. Crombie. And what we've had since then is consistent performance to budget. What the projected budgets were, what we were told would happen, what we were told they would achieve, we've almost always got that. We gave, I guess, DCHL the job of splitting Aurora Delta into two boards. Interestingly, they had come to that conclusion that that was necessary anyway, and they have given us, given the two companies, what was asked of them, and they're both performing pretty well given the cost and stress of actually doing that. We have, but most importantly, and this is why I think it's unfair to say, well, we're not getting any dividends. We were told by Mr. Crombie right from the start, you will not get dividends for some years. There has been a backlog that the companies borrowed to pay dividends to the council, and they're still paying off the debt that they raised to do that. So they made it quite clear that after a couple of years where they had some sort of reserves that they could pay over for, I think it was only 2 years, while we got things settled in here and pulled our belts in, it was made very clear that from then on, in the foreseeable future, there would be no dividends. So it's a bit unfair and a bit rich to say, well, you know, we should be getting dividends. We knew very well. It didn't snuck up on us. You're quite right about that.
Point of order, Your Worship.
Point of order, yeah.
It was not just the lack of dividends that has surprised.
What's the point of order? What's the point of order?
The point of order is that there is also an extra $44 million worth of losses.
That's not a point of order. Sit down. So I would say that we're in a we're in as good a position as we could have been, but more importantly, we're in the position that was becoming very clear from the moment we put a new board in place where we were tracking. And we have, I think we have not only the current board to thank for that, but the board led by the late Mr. Crombie, to whom I think we owe a considerable debt, no pun intended, as well. So thank you for that. Can I offer Councillor Lord your right of reply?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to comment too on that situation. The reality of it is that DCHL is still paying the interest and paying down debt on the stadium, and I think per the statement of intent is at $5.9 million per annum. And 3 years ago, when I found myself in the role of finding out about this problem, at that meeting, Grant, the previous CFO, Grant McKenzie, told me that there was $40 million, or just under $40 million, it might have been 39.5, that had been borrowed and was directly borrowed for a thing. I don't know if that happened on your 2004 to 2007 or 2007 watch, when that was borrowed. The last I heard, that was down to 18 million. So there has been 22 million paid off that debt, alongside 5.9 paid for the last few years as well. So I don't think it's fair to say the companies have produced nothing. The fact that we're not seeing it in our coffers like we once did, I'm okay with that. Totally comfortable with the fact that they're using it wisely to pay down debt that was incurred on our behalf.
Okay, I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. On to, thank you, Keith. Now, okay, well now on to notice of motion. Item 29, Councillor Wiley, I understand it's your notice of motion. I understand, Councillor Elder, that you have seconded this. Do you want to speak to your notice of motion, Councillor Wiley?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think, earlier this year the government announced its intention to merge the polytechnics into the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. Personally, I'd like to be standing here putting a motion forward about making sure the Otago Polytechnic remained autonomous and that we were going to fight the government on that basis. Or taking a regional approach and ring-fencing the SIT with us and going down that road. Because, you know what, they are the two quality institutions of the Polytech structure. But no, the government has chosen the route they're going to go down, and rather than try and fight the government on that basis, I'd rather work with them and get a greater outcome. And having both my 21-year-old son and my 18-year-old daughter both studying at the Otago Polytechnic, I believe the leadership, education and the Institute contributes to the importance of our city. I'm actually also a graduate of the Otago Polytechnic, having done a degree in applied management through the Capable program. So what are the facts around the Otago Polytechnic? 4,400 students. 180 million was the direct value of the Polytech of Dunedin's campus to the city's economy. That's a $40 million increase in the last 5 years. 5.9% increase in enrolments between 2017 and 18, and most related to trade training, exactly what our city needs going forward. 2,846 full-time equivalent jobs supported through direct Polytech expenditure in 2018 throughout Dunedin. And then we got the Cromwell campus, 8 million in value to the Cromwell economy and 200 plus students at the Cromwell campus. 135 FTEs jobs were created in that area. The Polytech is strong with their programs in Capable and Edubits, and they are the future of education. But also, let's not forget the role that the Polytech is playing in our community. It's building houses that are raising funds for local charities. Its Otago Polytechnic graduates will play a big part in the rebuild of the future of the hospital and other construction projects around the city. And, things like the involvement in the ID fashion and other events. This motion is about lobbying central government that Dunedin is the perfect location for the newly formed National Hub of New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. The key focus of this motion is that the DCC works with key local parties to present a strong business case to the Board of New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. I've been in contact by email with the Executive Director, Murray Strong, of the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. This is the new entity the government has set up. And he advised me this morning that his office will be running an RFP procurement process on behalf of the board, and that the terms of this RFP will be nearing completion and subject to approval will be released in early November. I think everyone around this table would agree that besides the recent growth of jobs from ACC, that previous governments haven't really shown Dunedin the love. And I think this will be a great way for this government to really show Dunedin some love. Dunedin is the best location for this hub. It will start out as a lean 100 plus or so team and will grow accordingly. We are an education city with a very successful education institutions. There are many factors that are going to be considered on where the hub is located. They have been identified in 3 key cities. They're looking at Dunedin, Christchurch and Napier, from what I understand. We have the accessibility networks, good flight linkages, especially to Wellington. But we also need to partner with our local MPs to continually push their colleagues that Dunedin is the best place to locate the hub here for the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. One question you may have is, why have I also put in the motion that we need $10,000? It shows that our willingness to work with the current Otago Polytechnic team to assist with or cover the cost of peer reviewing a business case to present to the Board of New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. We do have to fight for this. It will not just come to us. I am asking for all councillors to support this motion so our residents and central government gets a clear indication we want to be New Zealand's education city, and we as a council are doing everything to grow jobs in our city. Thank you.
Right. Councillor Elder, do you wish to speak to this?
What I was wanting to submit is that we want to be seen as Dunedin as a major education hub. Our Polytech has to be one of the most innovative in the whole of New Zealand and the most successful, with micro units and capable and many other innovative courses and even doctorates as well. So having an administration hub down here means that our Polytech will be modelling not a restrictive way of looking at education, but a very creative and innovative way of looking at Polytech and skills training. And wouldn't that be great when it comes to not having just generic kind of way of looking at things, because in fact Polytechs do have to be innovative, they do have to be creative, and having an administration hub in Dunedin will model that, and I believe that's the way of the future, and we want to stamp our mark as one of the major education hubs, especially in Polytechs in New Zealand.
Any other speakers? Councillor Laufiso.
Sorry, Your Worship, can I just ask questions of the movers?
Sure, absolutely.
Congratulations to you two for utilising our processes and making this notice of motion. I just want to know where, so the budget of 10,000 is unbudgeted, or where do you see it coming from? Communications, marketing?
I would ideally like to see it come from the CEOs or the Enterprise Dunedin.
Oh, okay.
Councillor Hawkins, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And I had a similar question in that if this is a campaign that council is supporting and there's a budget attached to it, we can't, halfway through the year, just budget money for something. So it would be useful to know, and the mover can reflect on that in their right of reply as to where that money would come from and what delegations this body has to direct departments of council to allocate resourcing to a campaign. I support this in principle when it's entirely consistent with the motion that council has already passed to support the Otago Polytechnic in its efforts to be as autonomous and as flexible and as responsive to local need as it can be. So I don't see this as being counter to that. But this is slightly different to other campaigns that council has been involved in where we have been pushing to protect something or preserve something. This is bidding for something, the details of which, or the criteria for which we're currently unaware of. And just in Councillor Wiley, sorry, and the movers speaking to this, it's unclear to me as to whether we're being asked to fund somehow an RFP process, so building a business case process, because then in part C, or the second B, it says we're being asked to assist with the campaign. So either this is a bid to apply for the hub to be located here through the process that is being set up by the board, and that's money potentially to support a business case development, or it's a campaign to have it located here, and that looks very different. And so if it is a campaign, which is what we're being asked to support, I'd be interested in some reflection on what that campaign might look like and how that might work in terms of how we're going to secure what the outcome is. But as I say, I'm entirely supportive of the principle of it. It's just unclear to me what its intention, what the implementation of this would look like, and again, where that money would come from, because it would appear that we don't have the delegation to direct staff budgets in that sense at this point in the financial year anyway. Thanks.
Councillor O'Malley.
Been a while since the Save Our Site campaign, but how did we budget that? Can I just get clarity on how that was budgeted?
Could you repeat that, Councillor?
Yes, a Save Our Site or Save Our Services campaign for the hospital. It ended up getting, that campaign I believe I got some budget. So I'm just wondering, can I have some clarity as to how that got budgeted?
Can I just ask the Chief to talk, just to give a bit of an explanation about what's happened to date, to give a bit of background to this?
So as well as us doing some lobbying in Wellington about this issue and about the siting of the new Polytech down here, we had an approach from the Polytech about whether we could assist them to write their business case on their behalf. I mean, specifically they named a specific staff member who has a completely full work program, and we just can't take him off things that he's already doing in the ED team. Writing business cases of this type is not generally our area of expertise outside of one or two people, and as I say, they were full. So we said we'd be willing to help. We'd particularly be willing to help with things like peer review, and we gave them some names of local people that we thought could potentially assist them. If you were of a mind to want to apply $10,000 to contribute to that business case, and that would get you a chunk of the way through it, then the process would be to request John to put that to the Grow Dunedin partnership for an expenditure out of that Grow Dunedin budget. The Chief Executive's budget is minute, but thank you for the kind suggestion to spend the tiny budget that I have. It might have been nice to pre-warn me, and I could have told you how much of it was already spent. Yeah, so that would be the process, and that's quite a doable process to go back and see, and I'd be surprised if it wasn't regarded as a priority for that Grow Dunedin partnership, actually.
Okay, Councillor Vandervis, sorry.
I'm glad that Councillor Wiley has actually specified a budget for this promotional or lobbying idea. I think that's what should have happened with the hospital site lobbying. We should have, when we made that decision, had a budget at the time suggested. But unfortunately for Councillor Wiley, that budget issue is the reason that I won't be voting for this. I'm quite happy to vote for A and B, but not what I assume should be C, the last line, budget of $10,000. I think that we have, as has been suggested by Sandy Graham, we do have a comms team, and we do have various other people that can lobby central government to get their commitment that the administration hub of the new combined Polytech structure be established in Dunedin, but actually putting aside an extra $10,000 for it at this late stage, as highlighted by Councillor Hawkins, I think is not only problematic, but it's unjustifiable. So I would ask that when voting for this, that we identify A, B and C, the last line, to be taken separately. Sure. And I would like to vote against C. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Gary.
My question's been partially answered, but it was really to the Chief Executive around what else could we do to support this.
Look, just one thing to clarify as well in addition to this, so I don't know how John will get on with the Grow Dunedin partnership, but just so that you do know, under the Council's, the delegations, the Council has delegated authority to overexpend budget. So if you make a decision that this is a priority, you can do that, and then you can say to us, we want you to find other places to save that, or you can not even say that. But at $10,000, our surplus every year is considerably larger than that. So if you want to put money towards a business case, pass a resolution that says we'd like to offer the Polytech $10,000 to assist with the business case and to assist in any other way that we can, which really means we'll continue doing what we're doing to assist.
Councillor Steadman.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, like the hospital matter, we had the iPads and we had some flyers and we did some marketing on Facebook. Could we not, that was obviously successful, so why can't we just follow the same template and, you know, get the same result?
Okay. I find myself a bit like some of the rest of you in support of most of this, but a bit ambivalent about the last one, as number C as well. But can I make it, so A is fine with me, B is fine with me, but can I make the point that the hub that will be, the administrative hub of the new combined polytechnic structure will not be in a polytech. It's something completely different, well, completely separate. And so I think we need to be clear about that, that if we are lobbying for that administrative hub to be in Dunedin, and I support that, then we don't necessarily need to be working hand in glove with the Polytech, and I don't think we need to be necessarily applying a specific funding. If it comes along that there's an opportunity to, or a need to spend something, that can be looked at. But I believe that this could be slightly reworded to actively lobby central government and support the Polytech's efforts to get the commitment to the administrative hub in Dunedin, and leave.
You can't reword a notice of motion.
I can't reword. I'm reliably informed you can't reword a notice of motion, especially someone else's. So, so as you were. So that leaves us with the as Councillor Van der Vis has requested, the option of taking each of these separately, and you can vote on them. But you now everyone knows as much as everyone else about how you can apply the money and whether you can vote for it. So if there are no further speakers, Councillor Gary, did you want to have another question?
Just a question, how we're going to handle the fact that it's A, B and B, just a process issue really.
Sorry, A,
B and B. There's two Bs.
Oh, we'll just call the second one a C, because on my agenda it's a C.
Oh.
So, Councillor Staines.
Thank you, Worship. I do support this notice of motion, and I also support discussing a funding line. So while it isn't the Polytechnic's job to put a business case up to have the hub here, I am sure the Polytechnic, and particularly Phil Kerr, would provide their knowledge to a consultant to prepare a business case. And I think, given that this thing will come out of the woodwork at us, if we are, as a city, serious about trying to have the decision made for the hub to come here, then perhaps it would be worth investing some money with a consultant to prepare a business case, or at least the framework of it, so that we have some momentum when the process does get underway. Because like most things the government does, you could find that it has a very limited time between asking for proposals and shutting it off. So front-footing that may well be a good thing to do, so I would support, if not a quantum number, but then at least putting it to the Grow Dunedin Partnership to look at whether, because I know there is still a little bit of money in their budget, whether they apply that money to helping get a business case underway.
Okay, are there any other speakers? Councillor Elder?
Just a question proceed. So we can't amend that C to say to apply to the Grow.
We can't amend it at all.
Okay, that's okay.
Councillor O'Malley. Oh, you've already spoken, but you've got a question.
Well, can I ask a question?
Ask a question.
I asked a clarification question earlier on.
Right.
Where did the budget come from? Given that we can't change this amendment, and therefore we're going to leave that $10,000 in there, but Grow Dunedin Partnership has been mentioned, I think that I'm happy to vote for C, knowing that it's probably an incomplete description of what we plan on doing. And I don't know what that means in terms of but I do not know what that means in terms of now the council's obligation to actually come up with $10,000, which is an issue, but I think I'll still vote for C.
Okay. The Speakers, Councillor Wiley, you'll write a reply.
Thank you, Your Worship. This has been a bit of a challenging one because even last night I was talking to Phil Kerr, who's currently in Copenhagen, about this. And the big part is, first off, I guess the word campaign is slightly misleading because it wasn't going to be something where we were going to be printing brochures and delivering those all around the community and saying anything along those lines. It was around, and it wasn't like about the hospital site or the courthouse campaigns that have happened in the past. This is about really working hard with central government and putting the best case forward to central government and to the Institute of Skills and Technology, is that the correct name? Sorry. In the sense of making sure we get the right business case going forward. That's what the $10,000 is for, and I think we've really gone through that discussion enough to know where we could head in that direction. So I would like your support on A, B and C for that. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to put them as requested separately. So all those in favour of A, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Thank you, that's carried. All those in favour of B, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. All those in favour of C, please say division on C. Thanks, Lynn.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Councillor Elder. Aye. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Aye. Councillor Hawkins. Aye. Councillor Lafiso.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Councillor Newell. Aye. Councillor O'Malley. Aye. Councillor Staines. Aye. Councillor Steedman.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis. No. Councillor Wiley. Yes. Councillor Wilson. Aye. Your Worship.
Aye.
Carried 13-2.
Thank you, that's carried. Thank you for that. Now,
13-2.
Okay. Now, I'll move that we move into non-public, and there's a few aspects to this, so listen up. I'll move that the meeting move into confidential for the meeting reasons outlined in the agenda pursuant to the provisions of the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act. I move that Ms Adams, General Manager, Dunedin City Holdings, be permitted to attend the meeting to speak to item C3, Dunedin City Holdings Group appointments and reappointments. And I move that Bevan Wilson, Director of Strathtyre Irrigation Company, Robin Wells, Project Manager, and Lenore Templeton, Committee Member, be permitted to attend the meeting to respond to questions for item C5, request for support application to the PGF for the Strathtyre Irrigation Fund in order to provide assistance in relation to the matters to be discussed. Seconded, Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Against? Carried. So we will give the camera crew 5 minutes to break things down, and then we'll be back in business.